The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 6. The Objective and Subjective Views of Life. Subjectivism proceeds from within and regards everything from the point of view of a containing and developing self-consciousness. The law here is within ourselves. Life is a self-creating process, a growth and development, at first subconscious, then half-conscious, and at last more and more fully conscious of that which we are potentially, and hold within ourselves. The principle of its progress is an increasing self-recognition, self-realization, and a resultant self-shaping. Reason and will are only effective movements of the self. Reason, a process in self-recognition; will, a force for self-affirmation and self-shaping. Moreover, reason and intellectual will are only a part of the means by which we recognize and realize ourselves. Subjectivism tends to take a large and complex view of our nature and being, and to recognize many powers of knowledge, many forces of effectuation. Even we see it in its first movement away from the external and objective method, discount and belittle the importance of the work of the reason, and assert the supremacy of the life impulse, or the essential will to be, in opposition to the claims of the intellect, or else affirm some deeper power of knowledge, called nowadays the intuition, which sees things in the whole, in their truth, in their profundities and harmonies, while intellectual reason breaks up, falsifies, affirms superficial appearances, and harmonizes only by a mechanical adjustment. But substantially, we can see that what is meant by this intuition is the self-conscious feeling, perceiving, grasping in its substance and aspects, rather than analyzing in its mechanism, its own truth and nature and powers. The whole impulse of subjectivism is to get at the self, to live in the self, to see by the self, to live out the truth of the self internally and externally, but always from an internal initiation and center. But still there is the question of the truth of the self, what it is, where is its real abiding place, and here subjectivism has to deal with the same factors as the objective view of life and existence. We may concentrate on the individual life and consciousness as the self, and regard its power, freedom, increasing light and satisfaction and joy as the object of living, and thus arrive at a subjective individualism. We may, on the other hand, lay stress on the group consciousness, the collective self. We may see man only as an expression of this group self, necessarily incomplete in his individual or separate being, complete only by that larger entity, and we may wish to subordinate the life of the individual man to the growing power, efficiency, knowledge, happiness, self-fulfillment of the race, or even sacrifice it and consider it as nothing except insofar as it lends itself to the life and growth of the community or the kind. We may claim to exercise a righteous oppression on the individual and teach him intellectually and practically that he has no claim to exist, no right to fulfill himself except in his relations to the collectivity. These alone, then, are to determine his thought, action, and existence, and the claim of the individual to have a law of his own being, a law of his own nature, which he has a right to fulfill, and his demand for freedom of thought, involving necessarily the freedom to err, and for freedom of action, involving necessarily the freedom to stumble and sin, may be regarded as an insolence and a chimera. The collective self-consciousness will then have the right to invade at every point the life of the individual, to refuse to it all privacy and apartness, all self-concentration and isolation, all independence and self-guidance, and determine everything for it by what it conceives to be the best thought and highest will, and rightly dominant feeling, tendency, sense of need, desire for self-satisfaction of the collectivity. But also we may enlarge the idea of the self, and as objective science sees a universal force of nature, which is the one reality, and of which everything is the process, we may come subjectively to the realization of a universal being, or existence, which fulfills itself in the world and the individual and the group, with an impartial regard for all, as equal powers of its self-manifestation. This is obviously the self-knowledge which is most likely to be right, since it most comprehensively embraces and accounts for the various aspects of the world process and the eternal tendencies of humanity. In this view, neither the separate growth of the individual nor the all-absorbing growth of the group can be the ideal, but an equal, simultaneous, and, as far as may be, parallel development of both, in which each helps to fulfill the other. Each being has his own truth of independent self-realization, and his truth of self-realization in the life of others, and should feel, desire, help, participate more and more as he grows in largeness and power, in the harmonious and natural growth of all the individual selves and all the collective selves of the one universal being. These two, when properly viewed, would not be separate, opposite, or really conflicting lines of tendency, but the same impulse of the one common existence. Companion movements separating only to return upon each other in a richer and larger unity and mutual consequence. Similarly, The subjective search for the self may, like the objective, lean preponderantly to identification with the conscious physical life, because the body is, or seems to be, the frame and determinant here of the mental and vital movements and capacities. Or it may identify itself with the vital being, the life soul in us, and its emotions, desires, impulses, seekings for power and growth and egoistic fulfillment. Or it may rise to a conception of man as a mental and moral being, exalt to the first place his inner growth, power, and perfection, individual and collective, and set it before us as the true aim of our existence. A sort of subjective materialism, pragmatic and outward-going, is a possible standpoint, but in this the subjective tendency cannot long linger, for its natural impulse is to go always inward, and it only begins to feel itself and have satisfaction of itself when it gets to the full conscious life within and feels all its power, joy, and forceful potentiality pressing for fulfillment. Man, at this state, regards himself as a profound, vital will to be, which uses body as its instrument, and to which the powers of mind are servants and ministers. This is the cast of that vitalism which, in various striking forms, has played recently so great a part and still exercises a considerable influence on human thought. Beyond it, we get to a subjective idealism, now beginning to emerge and become prominent, which seeks the fulfillment of man in the satisfaction of his inmost religious, aesthetic, intuitive, his highest intellectual and ethical, his deepest sympathetic and emotional nature, and, regarding this as the fullness of our being and the whole object of our being, tries to subject to it the physical and vital existence. These come to be considered, rather, as a possible symbol and instrument of the subjective life, flowing out into forms, than as having any value in themselves. A certain tendency to mysticism, occultism, and the search for a self independent of the life and the body accompanies this new movement, new to modern life after the reign of individualism and objective intellectualism, and emphasizes its real trend and character. But here also it is possible for subjectivism to go beyond and to discover the true self as something greater even than the mind. Mind, life, and body then become merely an instrumentation for the increasing expression of this self in the world. Instruments not equal in their hierarchy, but equal in their necessity to the whole, so that their complete perfection and harmony and unity as elements of our self-expression become essential to the true aim of our living. And yet that aim would not be to perfect life, body, and mind in themselves, but to develop them so as to make a fit basis and fit instruments for the revelation in our inner and outer life of the luminous Self, the secret Godhead who is one and yet various in all of us, in every being and existence, thing and creature. The ideal of human existence, personal and social, would be its progressive transformation into a conscious outflowering of the joy, power, love, light, beauty of the transcendent and universal Spirit.